Fort Sumter was formed in 1829 by order of the U.S. War Department. Naval ships unloaded tons of granite rubble from New England on the tiny man-made island of sand.
It was named after the South Carolina Revolutionary War hero Thomas Sumter. The location of Fort Sumter was in the center of the water entrance to Charleston Harbor, South Carolina.
By 1860, the fort was nearly 80% complete due to Congress's slow funding. Most of the cannons brought to Fort Sumter were left unmounted, but it still had the space capacity for 650 men plus the artillery.
From that moment onward, the United States government ruled Fort Sumter to be an impregnable fortress.
After Abraham Lincoln, a man known for his anti-slavery beliefs, was elected for presidency on November 6, 1860, tensions that were already present began to rise at an exponential rate as a reaction.
These tensions are mainly in the South, due to the different thoughts and views about slavery than the North. The North, for the most part, had completely outlawed slavery because they viewed it as inhumane.
In the South, however, people viewed slavery as a corporation for the many plantations, and without it they believed their companies would fall.
Bearing the impending thought no longer, South Carolina filed an ordinance of secession from the Union. This was carried out by the South Carolina Convention on December 20, 1860. The convention was held at St. Andrews Hall in Charleston, South Carolina.
As South Carolina's first act of secession, they ordered the evacuation of all Union-claimed forts and garrisons within the state's boundaries. If the Union did not evacuate, the state would send militiamen out to fire artillery upon them under the cover of darkness.
Upon hearing this news, Major Robert Anderson of the Union surveyed his current location, Fort Sumter on Sullivan Island. This was just across Charleston Harbor from Fort Sumter. When the evaluation was complete, Major Anderson decided that Fort Moultrie was too vulnerable from land attacks from the militiamen.
Under the cover of darkness on December 26, 1860, Major Anderson moved about 100 men onto rowboats and set off for the adjacent Fort Sumter that was set halfway across Charleston Harbor.
When the men arrived on the shores of Fort Sumter, Major Anderson immediately set to work writing a letter to the Secretary of War, Honorable J.B. Floyd. Major Anderson stated about his move, "If attacked, my men must have been sacrificed, and the command of the harbor lost. I spiked the guns and destroyed the cartridges to keep the guns from being used against us. If attacked, the garrison would have never surrendered without a fight. Major Robert Anderson."
On January 5, 1861, President Buchanan, in his last month of office, sent the first relief ship to Fort Sumter. The ship was an unarmed steamer called the Star of the West.
It was sent out of the New York City port on January 5th, hoping to arrive at Fort Sumter on January 9th, undetected by the South Carolina troops. On the Star of the West journey, South spies noticed the ship and relayed their findings to the South Carolina state troops.
When the Star of the West rounded the corner of the entrance to Charleston Harbor, the state troops opened fire on the steamer. After suffering 2 lethal blows, the Star of the West turned around in retreat. It was exactly 1.5 miles from its destination.
On January 11th, Major Anderson received a letter from the governor of South Carolina, Francis Pickens. The letter stated an immediate demand for surrender of Fort Sumter to South Carolina.
The same day, Major Anderson wrote a reply questioning Governor Pickens on why the state troops fired upon his resupplying vessel, and if this was a hint that war should fall upon them, even though he had not been notified of anything suggesting it by his Supreme. He was also attacked the fact that he believed that the governor had not approved of the firing and had taken place, and was lashing at the fact that Governor Pickens could not even control his own men.
Over the next 2 months, the South created the Confederate States of America and appointed Jefferson Davis as the president. Jefferson Davis overheard the discussion of the Provisional Congress to take Fort Sumter by force if it becomes necessary over the coming months. Upon hearing this, Jefferson Davis ordered General P.G.T. Beauregard to Charleston.
On March 3, 1861, General P.G.T. Beauregard arrived in the town of Charleston, where he immediately took control over Confederate forces stationed there. Over the course of the month, General Beauregard made many attempts to get Major Anderson to surrender to Fort Sumter, all the while keeping in close conversation with Jefferson Davis back in Montgomery, Alabama. On April 10th, General Beauregard demanded the surrender of Fort Sumter for the final time. Major Anderson refused, but added that if the Confederacy wait a day or two, his food would be gone and evacuation would take place without a shot. General Beauregard relayed his message to Jefferson Davis.
Jefferson Davis ordered General Beauregard to get a definite confirmation from Major Anderson. Then he added that General Beauregard to confirm an evacuation time for Fort Sumter, and by doing so, he could avoid the loss of blood and artillery. But if these circumstances were not met, General Beauregard had full authority to open fire upon Fort Sumter.
Major Anderson received the reply letter relayed via General Beauregard just after midnight on April 12th. 3 hours later, Major Anderson replied, saying that he would evacuate by noon on the 15th. In the meantime, though, he would not open fire unless attacked. Then he added that the promise was dependent upon not receiving additional supplies from the government or Union. But everyone, including Anderson, knew that relief ships would arrive before the 15th of April.
After the Confederacy and General Beauregard heard the reply from Major Anderson and talked among themselves, they concluded that Major Anderson's reply and promise were unsatisfactory. General Beauregard informed Fort Sumter of the Confederacy's decision and stated that they will be opening fire on them in 1 hour via the southern batteries that they had already claimed from the Union.
At around the time of 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861, a signal gun, a 10-inch mortar on Morris Island, across the harbor from Fort Sumter, flashed its gunpowder and rang out the first call of battle.
Citizens of Charleston raced to the rooftops in fright to see what they hoped they didn't want. Fort Sumter was being fired upon, and the entire harbor lit up in the darkness. Citizens watched in fear and astonishment as cannons fired. The harbor seemed to be surrounded by miniature volcanoes, belching forth fire and smoke, wrote one witness to the nighttime bombardment via the rooftop.
Shot and shell went screaming over Sumter as if an army of devils were swooping around it, recalled a member of Major Anderson's men. The shelling on Fort Sumter without return lasted about 3 hours. Then all of a sudden the Union guns took off firing at the various forts lining the harbor's coastline. It was Captain Abner Doubleday who returned the first return shot of the Union. It came from the right gorge angle casement, sighting the Confederates on Cummings Point on Morris Island. He fired and it was hit. Even though they shot their cannons, Fort Sumter was unable to reply to the shelling effectively.
That morning, news had spread of the attack made on Fort Sumter. Soon all the local newspapers had made their version of the causes of the attack. Some of the northern newspapers had learned of the attacks and received news via telegraph from southern newspapers. Even though the papers ranged in trustworthiness, they all had one thing in common. They all predicted war between the Confederacy and the Union to appear more and more hopeful in the coming months.
At 2:30 in the morning on April 13th, Major Anderson discussed with his men and decided that it was best to surrender the fort before any loss of life happened to either side. The following day, the Union's Stars and Stripes was lowered and replaced with the Confederate flag. This was shameful to the Union because it showed that they were weak and it boosted the hopes for the Confederacy to go to war. After the flag-raising ceremony, Major Anderson was to hand over the fort and evacuate his men promptly. Finally, the last Union fort was claimed in South Carolina.
There were no casualties during the bombardment of the fort and surrounding islands, but during the salute firing preceding the evacuation of Major Anderson's men, a cannon exploded prematurely, killing one artillerist and wounding 3, one mortally.
The devastation to the fort was enormous. The floor of the fort had craters from impacted shells landing on the granite. The cannons were spread throughout the fort, none in their correct positions, all due to the fact that the shelling from the Confederates was so heavy compared to what the fort was supposed to take on when designed.
The walls of Fort Sumter were literally falling off in blocks that could easily crush a man. Due to this fact, the Confederacy deemed Fort Sumter unsafe and uninhabitable for a while, so that the rubble had a chance to settle and not fall on a Confederate entering under the archway.
These are the flags that currently fly over Fort Sumter. Each one represents an important time in the fort's history. This plaque stands at the entrance to the fort, was given to the fort in honor of Major Anderson and his men, who fought through the battle stronger than any other Civil War battle. It was erected by the United States government in honor of these people and proclaims to date all who enter through the archway and into history.